Good morning. It's my distinct pleasure today to introduce you to Mitch Yockelson. I'm going to read you a little bit of his bio, but you guys know me, I'll tell a story. Mitch has been a professor at the graduate program at Norwich University. He's also been a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. He is currently an investigative archivist at the Office of the Inspector General at the National Archives and Records Administration, where he investigates the theft of historic documents, which we all applaud him for that effort. Mitch has written numerous books and articles including Borrowed Soldiers, The Americans Under British Command, which they listed as one of the best books in military history in 2008. He is a graduate of Frostburg University with a master's degree from George Mason University, doctorate in military from the Royal Military College of Science in Cranfield University, UK. Okay, that's all the bio stuff, so now you get the fun stuff of the story. I was a young researcher, I know it's hard to believe, back in 2000. This is how much World War I aviation ages you, by the way. And I was working on my book on Frank Luke, and I like most researchers, you go to the National Archives and you go to the reading room and you go, okay, what can you do? And they said, you got to meet this guy, Mitch. We'll introduce you to Mitch. So I met Mitch, and I said, I'm doing a book on Frank Luke Jr., and he sat there for a minute, and he is the John Gutman equivalent of what's in the archives when it comes to World War I. And he said, here's some stuff you ought to look at. And he gave me some records groups to look at, and he came back about an hour later and he said, the United States sent a mission after the war to write the history of World War I. And they went over and they copied all the German records. And they not only copied, they retyped them in the original German, but they translated a lot of them. But they never got the funding to finish the job or something like that. He said, and when they retraced all the maps from the German records as well. Well, as you guys know, a lot of the German records are just gone. And it turns out they're not. They're in the National Archives in Maryland. Literally, we brought out like 20-some boxes of stuff, and I spent 3 days going through this and a copious amount of money copying these things. And it gave me a completely different perspective of what was going on with Frank Luke. And from that point on, I realized Mitch is my go-to guy for anything I did in World War I. Of course, the archives, in their infinite wisdom, has moved him on to a new assignment. But I still reach out to him all of the time. He literally knows more about what's in the World War I records in the archives than anything else. He reached out to me recently about a new book that he's writing. And since I've been on the New York Times bestseller list, I get a lot of requests, can you read copies of my book? But I knew Mitch, and I was like, I'll read your book. I devoured it in 2 nights. It was so good. It really gives a context for how the air war fits in. There's some great stories in it. I was quite jealous, actually, when I got done reading it. But Mitch then countered with, here's my list of questions. So I got a homework assignment out of it, too. So it was great. So it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce you to a friend of mine and a great colleague, Mitch Yockelson.
I kind of don't know what to say at this point. I mean, that was an amazing introduction, and I returned the favor because without your help and your knowledge of Frank Luke, but also just of the Air Service in general, I couldn't have done this book. And I'd also like to thank Ted Hamady, even though I didn't bother him with this book, but I learned a lot about Ted. Is a longtime National Archives researcher, and I learned a great deal about him. And one of the things about working at the National Archives that we were always encouraged is to never pretend like we knew more than the researchers. The idea of being an archivist is to work with somebody who comes there, and it's an intimidating place. How many of you have done research at the National Archives? So, majority of you, and I remember I was in undergraduate at Frostburg and going to the archives for the first time to do research, And this is when everything was in Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. and walking through those big metal doors and being intimidated as hell. And you go into that beautiful research room and you know that so many people have been through there and you don't know what to do. And so I always empathize with that. But my point is that I never pretended like I knew more than the folks that were doing research, because clearly you've got a topic in mind and you know that topic better than I do. My job is almost like a movie director, in the sense of I'm going to guide you and tell you what I think you should look at, the sort of sources that I think you should, that might enhance your project, but I'm not going to tell you by any means, well, you don't know what you're talking about, and so forth. And what I really enjoyed about my experiences in being in the reference area is learning about other books, and learning about journal articles, magazine articles, and getting so-called turned on to these kinds of things. So taking this forward, 47 days, it's a story of the Meuse-Argonne, the largest battle that the United States Army participated in, not only in World War I, but in its history. More than 1 million men and women fought in that battle. And when I was thinking about this, and I was very lucky to get a contract with New American Library, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And it was a tough sell. As all of you know, as World War I historians, it's extremely difficult to get an interest on the U.S. in World War I by a publisher. And it took me a long time. Even, and this is not a new phenomenon, in my opinion, the best book on the U.S. in World War I is Edward M. Matt Kaufman's book, The War to End All Wars. And he likes to tell a famous story. It came out in 1968, Oxford University Press, their commercial end, published it. He tells this famous story that his agent, his publisher, said, you can't sell a World War I book, even if you put a dollar bill in each copy. But it certainly, he got it published, and it stood the test of time. And hopefully I won't have to put a dollar bill in each copy of the book, and people will buy it. And it's coming out on March 1st of 2016. Carl can certainly pass along my email to you. I have my cards, which I'll leave. Unfortunately, I have to physically leave after during our lunch break, but I'll be happy to stand around and answer any questions you might have that you don't throw out at me during the course of my presentation. And what I tried to do is not only look at the ground troops, but also incorporate other aspects of the Army, including the Air Service. And that's how I reached out to Blaine and got his knowledge and tapped into it, because I had to talk about, of course, Frank Luke. Of course, I had to talk about Eddie Rickenbacker, but I found a few other little gems of Air Service personnel. And it was almost like when I was writing this book, even though I've worked at NARA since 1988, a long time, and like they say in the military, it's not just a job, but it's been an adventure, it's been a career. And even though I don't work in the reference area anymore and I kind of play a role of history detective, I still have my hand in research, because folks that I've known for a long time will write and say, hey, can you at least give me some advice? And I'm happy to do that. Also, I'm heavily affiliated with the United States World War I Centennial Commission. If you don't know about the commission, it was chartered by Congress about 1.5 years ago. And its mission is to educate the American public in regards to the role of the United States in the Great War. Unfortunately, Congress chartered the commission. President Obama appointed several commissioners, but as you're going to be shocked to hear, they gave them no money. So right now, most of the money has come through private donations. The Pritzker Library in Chicago has been extremely generous, plus a number of other corporations. And it might be something that the League would want to get involved in to make sure that the role of aviation is known about to the American people. One of the projects that they've undertaken is to help with the Lafayette Escadrille Monument in Paris. How many of you have been to the monument? It's beautiful. It's in an obscure place in Paris, in a beautiful neighborhood. I don't even think it's considered the city of Paris, but in April of next year, the monument is being rededicated, and the American Battle Monuments Commission has done quite a bit to help fund it and make sure the refurbishing. So anyway, let's talk about, what I want to talk about today, and what Carl asked me to talk about is doing research at the National Archives, but also talk about a couple of other repositories, including the Library of Congress, and how I was able to utilize their records to write this book, but it also really helped re-educate me as far as understanding the role of the Americans in the war, and obviously the talk today is focused on the aviation. Let's see here. Okay, there we go, I got it figured out. So the guy that's the main focus of the book, and somebody that I've admired for a long time. When I first started reading military history books as a kid, one of the first I got was on Eddie Rickenbacker, another was on Alvin York, but I certainly became aware of General Pershing, partially because as a kid I went to my physician who was on Pershing Drive in Silver Spring, and I had really no connection between him, Pershing Drive, and General Pershing, other than I was nervous as hell of going to see the doctor. But I learned to respect and actually admire General Pershing. And if you've read any biographies of him, and I can certainly recommend some, he's one of these guys who is larger than life, and you either really liked him or you thought he was kind of a pompous ass. I was fortunate enough to become friends with John S.D. Eisenhower, the surviving son of Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. And I got to know him when he wrote his wonderful book on the American Expeditionary Forces called Yanks. And he actually knew Pershing, so we would talk about that quite a bit. He didn't care for Pershing. He felt that Pershing had squandered the American Expeditionary Forces and wasn't a good commander. I take a different task, and if you read my book, you'll see that I talk about Pershing and warts and all, but overall I think he was the right guy to command, and despite all the pressure he received from the Allied commanders to get lost, I'm glad that Secretary of War Newton Baker didn't take them up on that, and then President Wilson also backed him up. So Pershing becomes an important part of the story. And as far as the aviation goes, as you know, he led the punitive expedition in Mexico in 1916 and into 1917, and it was the first time that the Americans deployed an aero squadron under Benny Falloy. And so Pershing was intimate with this, even though the first aero squadron didn't do all that well in Mexico. For the most part, nor did most of the punitive expedition. It became important to Pershing. So one of the first things that he wanted to do was organize an aviation section once he got to France. And the guy that becomes synonymous with this is Billy Mitchell. He's another very controversial figure, and I'm not going to go into great detail because you guys know far more about him than I'll ever know. But I became fascinated with him as well, almost because of a book written by an author, Douglas Waller, who wrote a great biography of Mitchell, but focusing more on what he called the crime of the century, the trial of the century, and that was the court-martial of Billy Mitchell. But he wanted to go back and understand Billy Mitchell during World War I, and so I got to know more about Mitchell through Doug Waller, and then be able to utilize him through and kind of weave him into the story I tell about the Meuse-Argonne. So just a little bit of background that you already know, but it's fascinating to me. I mean, he was born in Nice, France. He served in a volunteer Wisconsin regiment during the Spanish-American War, kind of the same war that General Pershing basically cut his teeth in. And then later on, he got involved in the Signal Corps. As you know, they were the ones that were responsible for aviation until the American Air Service was formed in France as part of the American Expeditionary Forces. He rose through the ranks really quickly, became a colonel, first a lieutenant colonel, and then became the temporary rank of colonel. These were ranks that the American Army handed out, that kind of like the brevet system during the Civil War. And then later on, in October 14th, in the midst of the Meuse-Argonne, he was promoted to the temporary rank of brigadier general. And Mitchell, as I would read about him, he was somebody that, I'm sorry to say, a lot of the officers thought he was a pain in the ass. And he bragged a lot. He was somebody that kind of rubbed you the wrong way, but he was a smart guy. And I don't think, in fact, he and Falloy had fought literally, toe-to-toe when they both first got over to France. And Falloy didn't like him, thought he was a loudmouth, thought he was very brash. He was the type of guy that if you went to a party, Mitchell wanted you to know that he was there, the way he dressed and the way he acted. Falloy was a lot more laid back. And because of his brashness and because Mitchell forced himself out to the front, Pershing ended up selecting him to take over the primary role of the AEF Air Service. Whoops. And then, of course, you can't tell the story about the AEF Air Service, especially during the Meuse-Argonne, without talking about Eddie Rickenbacker. And I primarily relied on his memoirs and the wonderful stories that he told. And of course, he ended up becoming the ace of the AEF with his 26 victories, because sadly, Frank Luke didn't survive the war. He dies within the second day of the war. But he had 18 victories up until that point. And I think there's no doubt that Luke would have been the ace of the AEF Air Service had he survived. And so what I did is I looked at these individuals, and to help tell the story and utilize the existing records that are out there. And as historians, we're incredibly lucky that the American records, there's a treasure trove out, not only at the National Archives, but other repositories. When I did a previous book, which was my dissertation that became the Borrowed Soldiers book, I relied a lot on records in Great Britain. I was fortunate enough to go to Australia and do research at the War Memorial there for a few weeks. And I came back recognizing that the American records are far superior than at least those records. I didn't do research in the French records, so I can't speak too highly, or I can't speak authoritative on them. And going back to General Pershing, he's the reason why a lot of the records survive today. And when the war ended as an armistice on November 11th, and most of these guys were sitting around with literally nothing to do, Pershing made sure that they wrote histories. And so you have all these wonderful accounts in the National Archives and elsewhere. And a guy that I kind of took a strong interest in. Has anybody ever heard of Stackpole before? Okay, of course John has. No surprise there. He wrote a wonderful diary. He was a Boston lawyer, joined the Army. He became associated with Hunter Liggett. Liggett, if you know anything about the AEF, started out as a training officer in a reserve division. One of the smartest guys, if not the smartest guy in the AEF. Pershing knew this, immediately pointed him to First Corps once the AEF got up and running, and Stackpole joined him as his aide. And Stackpole wrote a diary of his service under Hunter Liggett from late 1917 and even on through early 1919. And it's an incredibly valuable resource. It's owned by the George C. Marshall Library down in Lexington. A portion of it's been published by historian Robert Farrell, who's done a lot of books, and he takes excerpts from it. I used it to go through, and the interesting thing about Stackpole is that he doesn't mince words. And I believe it's available online now through George C. Marshall Library. But Stackpole was extremely critical of Billy Mitchell, because Billy Mitchell would hang around both Liggett's headquarters when he was at 1st Corps, and then when Liggett took over as head of 1st Army in mid-October at Souilly, Mitchell would also go there all the time. And Stackpole just could not stand him and would criticize him considerably. But this is just an example of a resource that few other historians had thought to use in the context of the AEF, and especially the Air Service, because Stackpole commented on a significant amount of other officers and really gave a good critical eye. The Library of Congress, and I'll talk about that a little bit before I get into the National Archives. Their manuscript division in the Madison building up on Capitol Hill really is second to none. And their resources there are invaluable for anyone who is planning on doing any research on the First World War. And the sources that I became familiar with, of course, are papers of Pershing. They were donated by his son after his death, and they include a wide scope of personal letters and other accounts that were sent to him. Billy Mitchell's papers are there, at least the main body of them, a good informational source, diaries, letters, all kinds of content, and he would comment on, of course, other officers, which is important. Some of Eddie Rickenbacker's papers are there as well. And not only the manuscript division, which is relatively easy to use. If you haven't been there, you go in this room, and after you sign in and basically turn over all your rights as a human being, and they give you a locker to use, they have a lot of wonderful finding aids which help you get into the papers. Most, if not all of them, are also available online today. In addition to the personal papers of the Library of Congress, you can't ignore their prints and photographs division. It is an amazing resource. Today, a fair amount of it is available online. The only problem with their prints and photographs division, as opposed to NARA's, which I'll get to in a moment, is there are a lot of restrictions in using them, and also they charge, in some cases, a user fee for their photographs and prints and so forth. They also have an amazing newspaper and periodical collection, most of which is on microfilm, so you can use that and print out itself. But these days, a lot of this stuff has been digitized, so you can go on online newspaper resources. And I really urge you to look at newspapers. I relied quite a bit on the Washington Post and the New York Times because I had access to those. And the reporting during World War I was absolutely phenomenal. And even though for the Americans, the reporters had to go through censorship under General Pershing, but still their accounts, their details of what was going on in France and just describing the battles, or even before the U.S. got into the war. And they're really easy to use because, especially for the Post and the New York Times, there's a wonderful search path. So you could just type in names of individuals, names of villages, really anything. And whoever digitized this did, again, a phenomenal job, so you can pick up quite a bit. So now going to the place that I'm most familiar with, the National Archives. It started out originally as the National Archives and then became part of GSA, and it was called the National Archives and Record Services. And then in 1985, the Archives decided they wanted to be an independent agency of the executive branch of the government, so they fought tooth and nail. They revolted from the government, from GSA, and became the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, which is what I know it as. Not only is the facility in Washington and where I work primarily in College Park, but there are facilities all over the United States. In fact, there are 44 facilities, including presidential libraries from Herbert Hoover up through George Bush, soon to be Barack Obama. But there are also regional archives throughout the U.S. that have records, and you never know what you're going to find in these sort of things. And because the government, in its infamous wisdom, creates a lot of paperwork. Nowadays, of course, it's all electronic. But for historians, and I'll quote the late Stephen Ambrose, who said, "The National Archives is the mother's milk for historians." And I think if you've done research there, despite the fact that you have to, again, like the Library of Congress, go through a lot of bells and whistles and so forth to get a researcher card and policies, it is a phenomenal place to research. And I've been proud to not only research there, but to work there since 1988, and it's still an enjoyable place despite all its little bureaucracies. So I'm going to go through a list that I came up with, and I'll be happy to expand upon any of them if you have questions afterwards. Record Group 18, Records of the Army Air Forces. And the main body of these records were created after World War II to document what was going on with the Army Air Forces during the Second World War. But the Air Force, which took over this function, went back and looked at the First World War. So you have all of this so-called general correspondence relating to all the flying fields in the United States. And most of the stuff in Record Group 18 is domestic. So if you hunt far enough, you probably could find some things on the Princeton guys, on the Harvard guys, and some of the other Ivy League air service units. But also, all of the aero squadrons, their administrative records were placed together and within a general correspondence. And if you want to know how an air squadron functioned before the war, and how they trained and so forth, it's a good body of records and really kind of gives you a sense more of the administrative role. The Quartermaster General, and what I learned in being an archivist and also doing my own research is that I was taught that you need to look outward. In other words, let's say you're doing research on the 94th Aero Squadron. Well, obviously you want to look at those records. But you also want to look at how they fit in with the greater scheme of not only the U.S. government, but the Army itself, and what it was attached to. And so the Quartermaster records, and I'll talk about them at the end of my talk a little bit more detail, obviously we're supplying the Army. So if you want to know about the types of uniforms, the types of equipment, food, and so forth, that all went through the Quartermaster General, and that's Record Group 92. The obvious one is Record Group 111, Chief Signal Officer. For the early air service, which was part of that, and included the original contract that the Wright brothers signed with the Army, but also just the development of the air service. You find wonderful correspondence within this records. But also, the Chief Signal Office took care of all of the photography, both motion picture and still photographs. And I think you would agree with me if you've done research there. NARA is second to none as far as having the original Signal Corps photographs and motion pictures. But you have to keep in mind, though, that these things were all censored. And so you have images that pretty much are, nice, clear images of air service pilots, like the one I showed you of Eddie Rickenbacker and the one of Frank Luke. So they're standing in images. You're never going to show images of a guy that's been killed in battle, whether it's plane crash or he's shot on the battlefields in France or Belgium. During the Civil War, you had those gruesome images that Matthew Brady and his protégés took of bodies at Devil's Den and other places in Gettysburg and elsewhere. Of course, we know that a lot of those were staged and brought forward. You won't find that. And General Pershing was very careful about that. He wanted the American people to have a certain image of their young men overseas and showing them maimed. You do have photographs, of course, of hospitals, but they're also very carefully done. But again, a wonderful collection. Because they were the Signal Corps images and multiple copies were made, you do find them in other repositories as well. The main body, and what I would say is the mother's milk for the AEF, is Record Group 120. And again, I have to give credit to General Pershing for making sure that there was a historical office attached to the AEF, and the fact that he assigned and urged and required officers to write historical accounts, and they really are well done. And despite the fact that there's been some criticism that they, tell one side of the story, I don't agree with that. You can find, again, the problems of the AEF, whether it's the Air Service, whether or not it was the coordination between the Air Service and the infantry. And there were a lot of problems. There were a lot of complaints from infantry divisional officers especially, complaining directly to Billy Mitchell that, why are there so many German planes over our front? Why is the AEF Air Service, Mitchell, why are your men not shooting down these planes? And you see a lot of that banter that goes back and forth in those correspondence in Record Group 120. And then Record Group 165, which Blaine mentioned, has a wonderful collection of the records that were copied after World War I. The War College Division sent its historians to Germany, to Italy, to Great Britain, to France, Austria, Hungary, and a couple of other places. And the idea was to copy records of both the Allies and the belligerents as they pertain to the Americans. Smartly and luckily, some of the historians who looked at the German records also copied pre-World War I stuff. So you have things relating to the Schlieffen Plan, you have records relating to the Eastern Front in this body of records that, as he correctly pointed out, a lot of these things were destroyed during World War II. But also, within Record Group 165, the War College Division, which was in Washington, they were historians as well. And so they also filed reports on a lot to do with aviation. And you have wonderful accounts of the aero squadrons in Record Group 165 that are not duplicated in Record Group 120. And this includes photographs and maps, but also a lot of good narrative. And the guy that's really responsible, and if you've done any research on the American Expeditionary Forces Air Service, you need to be thankful to Colonel Edgar Gorrell. Local guy, born in Baltimore in '91, graduated West Point in '12. A few years later, he learned to fly in San Diego, and then was part of Floyd's first Aero Squadron in Mexico. And then he came over to France, and this is just a brief bio of him. Was chief of the technical section, and then later the strategical section. But more importantly to all of us is, at the end of the war, he was appointed to gather up the histories of the AEF Air Service. And he did a phenomenal job. And it's now affectionately known as Gorrell's History of the AEF Air Service. The archives microfilmed this back in the 1970s, and then copies have been distributed. And it is the go-to source for AEF Air Service. Not only did he go through there and he had all of the officers write accounts of the aero squadrons, he collated photographs that you don't find elsewhere, maps, technical reports about building up the Air Service. But a source that I found particularly enlightening and useful for my book is that he interviewed Air Service POWs, or at least he had his staff do that. And you have these accounts written by POWs that are just absolutely amazing. And they really tell a different story of the Air Service and what it was like to be, first off, shot down, left in some field, and then have German officers come up to you and then taken away. One of the accounts that I use is that of Marion Cooper, who was in the AEF Air Service, shot down on the second day. You might know him as later fame of King Kong. He was I guess it was a cinematographer, or he had that sort of role. But he gives a really interesting account of what it was like, along with his co-pilot Weiser, to have been taken POW. All of these things have been now copied by Fold 3, which is one of these conglomerates that competes with Ancestry to put things online. Unfortunately, what Fold 3 did, though, is they reproduced the microfilm. They didn't go back and do a redigitization of the records. So while they're fairly easy to use, you can't use a really good search like you can with the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it's certainly made these records widely available, and I can't stress to you of how an important source they are. And to wrap up, so I can leave time for questions before everybody scatters for lunch, going back to Record Group 92, there's an incredibly valuable source, and that's the burial files. The burial files were created by the Graves Registration Service, luckily by a colonel with the last name of Pierce. Pierce had been in the Quartermaster Corps. He served along with Pershing during the during the occupation of the Philippines after the Spanish War. And that was the first time that the U.S. government decided that they were going to repatriate American casualties. And so he helped bring bodies back from the Philippines during that period. So jumping ahead to 1918, as the U.S. first gets engaged in combat, Secretary of War makes an announcement that the American government had to stand by is casualties, the American people, you, the mothers, the wives, fathers, you will have an opportunity once the war ends to decide where you want your loved ones buried. And so, much to the chagrin of our other Allied partners, the British and the French particularly, the promise was made that you can either have your loved ones buried for perpetuity in France and in Belgium and elsewhere in permanent cemeteries, or brought back to the U.S. A little more than 50% of the American families at government expense had their loved ones brought back for burial in national cemeteries like Arlington or local cemeteries, and they could choose whether to have a government headstone or a private headstone. But those that are buried overseas are, of course, in the American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries like Frank Luke at the Meuse-Argonne, where there's more than 14,000 buried. It's actually the largest cemetery, larger than the Normandy Cemetery. But where the records are extremely valuable is that all of them were brought together, all the GRS files for the more than 100,000 Americans who died in the war. About 50,000 were combat casualties, the other 50,000 were from the flu, plane accidents, disease, other diseases, suicides, and other accidents and so forth. So the National Archives has more than 100,000 burial files. And for those that died overseas in combat, what the GRS would do is that they would go look for the graves, and if they knew where they were, usually they had one of the two dog tags nailed to the temporary wooden crosses. But they often would ask for witnesses about how a soldier or a pilot died. And so you get this literally information. Usually it's no more than a paragraph, but vital information on how a soldier died or a pilot, where their plane went down, and they would use that information to search for the soldier, the doughboy as we call them. But also, what's breathtaking about these records is for those that remained overseas, jumping ahead into around 1930 was the Gold Star Mother Program, where the government paid to send mothers and wives of those who remained behind overseas to cemeteries. But keep in mind, this is the heart of the Depression. Government has very little money. They're not paying the bonus to the soldiers who came a couple of years later in 1932 to fight for their bonus. But they did send the mothers and wives over. And all of that information is in the burial files. Plus the fact you have letters written by families wanting to know what happened to their loved ones. It's very, very touching information, and it adds a certain touch to the files. So anyway, I'll leave my talk on that kind of somber note, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have about doing research at the National Archives or maybe the Library of Congress or elsewhere. So, yes, sir.
You were talking about Gorrell not being digitized and Fold 3 having done it from the microfilm. And Carl and I and others have been thinking long and hard about how to ultimately have a fully digitized Gorrell. Is there any process by which people can request the archives to take on and schedule and budget a project like that, to like digitize Gorrell?
Money. Yeah. We've had we have a wonderful an anonymous donor who's come through and given, I'm not sure how much, but a lot of money to the archives to digitize all of the Signal Corps films. And so some of those are already up on the archives YouTube. But I can tell you that because Fold 3 already did this, and it was a partnership between the archives and Fold 3, which is kind of complicated and not really very favorable to the government, the archives can say, no, it's already done. But if something you wanted to do, and I would suggest maybe doing a certain portion of it, you could conceivably go to the archives and say, look, we want to do all the Air Squadron historical narratives, or we want to do all the POW reports and this kind of thing. Would you give us access to the original so we can digitize them, and then we can put them in such a manner that they're easily searchable? And I think that's a legitimate request. The archives is not going to do it on their own because they don't have the money. Carl?
It's 77,000 pages.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's massive. And you said that it was microfilmed, and because the Fold 3 used the microfilm version, the optical character recognition is not as precise or as searchable as other records are. And granted that's the case, the interesting thing that I have found is that if you go to Fold 3, you can do the search there on the document and look through some of it, because I've looked through for certain material in the Gorrell report, and I've had some luck with some of it. But when you download it from the site from Fold 3, what you get is you don't get a PDF copy. You wind up with an image, and then you have to then create a PDF, and then you have to do the OCR completely over.
Yeah.
Was that purposefully done? Do you know?
I honestly don't. There was some. What happened is, and this is one of my criticisms of the place I love, the archives, is they were behind the 8 ball as far as digitizing went. And so places like Ancestry, and then I think Fold 3, which I think is a offshoot of Ancestry, but don't quote me on that, and a couple of others. Is it?
Or it's owned by
Okay.
Ancestry.
So they came forward and said, hey, look, you guys are really behind. Here's what we're going to do. We'll digitize records that you suggest, but also things that we think are valuable because their main focus are genealogists, but historians as well. And so what are the sort of things that have a lot of names in them? And the nice thing about Gorrell's, better than any other AEF records, is they have lists of all of they have rosters in there of all the pilots and crew and that kind of thing. So that's what made it valuable. So they went ahead and kind of did this on their own with not a whole lot of guidance, and unfortunately not a whole lot of forethought.
Yeah. We've downloaded the entire 77,000 pages from Fold 3 as image files and converted it to PDF. And Charlie is now trying to figure out how to make that more accessible and usable as within the league structure, and it's when you're dealing with that many pages, it's you're dealing with 135 gigabytes of data. So,
have you thought about reaching out to the Air Force, whether, or are you at Colorado Springs?
I'm going to leave this to
as like a
others.
teaching tool and seeing if they would cough up
It's a
some money.
really good idea. It's a really good idea.
I know I'm pretty sure at the Air Force Academy they have a copy of Gorrell.
And I believe there's only a couple of copies of the original Gorrell out there.
Yeah, I don't know where this, obviously NARA has one. Also, I should mention, and Ted, when he came to the archives, utilized another series of AEF, Air Service, correspondence that was, I believe, also gathered by Gorrell, but not microfilm. Some of it has duplicates, but I remember helping him with it, and there's a very convoluted finding aid, a list that that was put together not by the archives, but by either the Air Force or the Air Service. But there's also a lot of gems in there about, for example, about training with the British and other foreign aviation. So if you do come to the archives, don't focus entirely on Gorrell, but go through the Record Group 120 inventory, and you can find some other things that are somewhat obscure. Any other questions?
Just a comment.
Yeah.
Burial records are phenomenal. I've never gone through them. There's some of them are just very boring. Here's a tooth diagram of the body, and it matches his or her dental records. Some of them are this thick, with correspondence from the family, pictures from the family, pictures of the mothers who went on the Gold Star tour. There's newspaper articles. It is incredible what you find in there. You look up some of the guys like Victor Chapman who flew with the Lafayette Escadrille. You get into the whole back and forth about was that really his body in the grave? And so you get friends in arguing, well, I looked at it, it's him, and then you get other folks weighing in going, no, that Paul Rockwell going, no, that can't be him, and here's why, and his family prying open the body to check it out. And if you look up Norman Prince, it will absolutely, it's War and Peace, because God knows they've moved him around enough. Those records are just, they offer you, sometimes you get views of families having arguments about where the body goes. Well, he got divorced, the wife wants him in the United States, but I think he should stay where he's at, and they're trying to drag the federal government into it. It's incredible stuff. You can't believe the little nuggets you pick up.
Yeah, the one that's most striking, you're probably not going to be surprised, is Quentin Roosevelt's. I don't know if you looked at that.
No, I haven't.
It's pretty thick. All of these, unfortunately, have been moved out to St. Louis at the National Personnel Record Center because they, in a lot of ways, help fill in the gap of, as you might know, there was a fire in 1973 that destroyed vast majority of Army records from around 1917 through the early 50s. So the burial files have been moved out there. Some of them I think will be digitized, but and maybe Quentin Roosevelt's and some of the other widely known people like Joyce Kilmer. So thank you for your time. Oh, I think Ted has a comment.
I'll just point out one record that I found extremely entertaining, and that was the court-martial record, one particularly of the he was CEO of the 94th, who was court-martialed after the war for bringing a woman of ill repute to a dance. The testimony was given by Douglas Campbell, Eddie Rickenbacker, everything in favor of the CO, and he was exonerated, but there were some appendages that made it really worth reading.
And just lastly, you made me think of Billy Mitchell's court-martial file, which is, I think, 30-some boxes. It's huge, but you have all the testimony in there of both Naval and Army Air Corps aviators. So it's another source if you want to just get a glimpse into that whole sort of hierarchy in that world of aviation. Even though it's post-World War I, they obviously talk about what was going on around that time. So you're right, the court-martial files do reveal quite a bit because these guys are under oath. And they usually hated each other, so they weren't afraid to talk poorly about one another. Thank you very much.